Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 371. Jack the Ripper probably never even existed. This is going to be, I'm sure, controversial among some crime buffs that happen to watch this video. Link in the description to the wiki about it, whatever. Wikipedia is still good for things like this. Not so good for anything socio-political, or things that are scientifically related at this point. Pretty soon they'll start scrubbing history Stalin style too, so maybe Jack the Ripper will be declared to be, I don't know, have had Nazi ties before the Nazi Party existed or something. Here's my theory. I've been looking into the Jack the Ripper case, and I have a casual interest in serial killers, and the reason this is in the Occult playlist, of course, is a lot of people think there are Freemasonic connections, ritual murder of some spiritual or occult sort. I think we can discount that basically out of hand. Some of the people that were reckoned to possibly be Jack the Ripper couldn't have been. The laundry list of potential suspects is in the many dozens. You'll find that this is the case with most sensationalized murder sprees throughout history. All of a sudden you have 100, like D.B. Cooper didn't even murder anyone. Look at the laundry list of suspects in that case. I think he probably just fucking died when his parachute didn't open, but we'll see. Maybe we'll get some closure on that case in 1,000 years due to some archaeological expedition. But here's what I was thinking. I was thinking about specifically the time period of the Jack the Ripper murders, the Whitechapel murders. You've got the canonical five, you've got others that are suspected to be part of a cluster of cases. They are all in a relatively small area, etc., etc. And I was thinking, considering the fact that towards the end of the 19th century is when you start getting any real compilation of crime data, the application of basic forensics, the expansion by the way of the press as the middle class becomes more literate, is it not possible that you're simply seeing a pattern that does not exist? So you're seeing bodies that were actually recovered. Of course, if you don't have a body and you have some urchin or drifter with, illiteracy, who's not known by anyone, who gets carved up and dissolved in acid, that killing you don't know anything about. You could end up with a perfect murder spree sort of situation. Again, in the late 1800s, forensics were more crude and basic. You could end up with someone successfully killing 30, 40 people, never end up getting caught, die of old age or a heart attack or something, and you don't even know that there was a serial killer there. It's a little bit different than now with modern genetic testing, surveillance equipment. None of these things really existed at the time. It was, again, very basic. But as the consciousness of society in the late 19th century began to increase. Again, the middle class is gaining more literacy and sometimes more mobility, although really depended on where you were in the first world. The upper classes started to bitch and groan about the conditions of the poor, partially because those ghettos, in some cases, were not that far removed from their McMansions. It was basically a crude form of NIMBYism, if you will. They started to look into murders. 20, 30 years prior, you find a dead body in the slum, in the ghetto, where people for 2 pence are offering themselves for the night, or for a loaf of bread, which was literally the conditions that you had in that area. You've got the gin palaces, people are drunk, people are carousing, there's a lot of prostitution. There would have been a lot of murder anyway. But all of a sudden, the upper and now middle classes began reading about these things. They really hadn't before. Again, this is the time period of huge social transformation, especially in urban areas in Western Europe and parts of the United States. All of a sudden, they started attempting to figure out who was doing these things. And so even if two murders were only potentially tangentially linked, they made a link. And then moral panic set in, sensationalism. Because when they went to bed at night, mama and dada reading the newspaper, all of a sudden they find out that, a mile away there have been 3 murders and the police think that they're linked. Then you end up with the possibility, we have it today, of copycats. Certainly, the gruesome details were offered by the press due to sensationalism. You get copycat murders, you get hoaxes. There were a slurry of letters sent in, for example, in the wake of the leather apron thing. And a kidney, partially pickled, was sent in to one press member at one point, claiming the from hell letter, basically, were sent into the cops. They determined that most of them had nothing to do with the possibly canonical original. But you don't know how many murders actually were taking place under one person. It could have been 2 or 3. That doesn't mean that even the original canonical five are the work of the same person. It could have very well been unconnected murders that had topical similarities. At one point, they were trying to examine the irises of one of the victims to try to see if an imprint of the killer had been burned photographically onto the eye lens and stuff. This was the experimental period and the social reformist period of the late 19th century. My theory is that unconnected murders that 20 years prior would not have been connected because there would have been no attempt in the ghetto to connect them. And people would have been partially decomposed, fed to the hogs. This happened in the Old West occasionally, by the way. And nobody would have cared because they don't even necessarily know who the victim is in some cases. Their identity wouldn't have even been fully documented. Now, you also have the rise of more bureaucracy around this time, allowing you to actually document sort of what's there more ably than certainly you would have in the late 1700s or something like that. London had a huge amount of ghetto-urban sprawl at the time, sort of like the Malthus thing going on, and it went through the cracks. There was all this crime going on, and nobody really cared. All of a sudden, though, the new literate class did care, and so they got all panicky. And the rich started talking about social reform and the public welfare and how we must help these poor, unfortunate individuals. Social reform movements were common around this time up through the early 20th century. And then having achieved their goals, most of them got corrupted. I think that unconnected murders that shared topical similarities were initially seized upon by a sensationalist press that had a brand new audience of middle classers anyway by that time, and by those people panicking. And they demanded something be done, and so the government said, well, they're probably, oh shit, these two people had their throats cut. Clearly it was the same person who cut their throats. It's not just a high crime area anyway where people are dying anyway by the droves and on a fucking weekend. They had to look into it, thus generating more sensationalism. And then you get copycatting. That's what I think explains Jack the Ripper. I think that the latter cases are copycats, possibly even some of the canonical five. I think that it was the work of multiple people. I don't think there was a Jack the Ripper. That is, that the individual, the concept of a central persona that killed a bunch of prostitutes and other people out of some, they've done all sorts of psychological studies. Well, did the Ripper get spanked too much as a kid? Maybe the Ripper was gay and took out frustration on the women that he felt didn't titillate him enough and he felt like a freak or something. They've got all these theories, but you don't even have a central persona. You have no description. You have no reason even to trust the forensics and the investigation of the notoriously corrupt police of the late 19th century anyway. If it had been a cop that was killing people, they probably would have gone thin blue line and blue wall of silence on that bitch. So how do you even trust the original accounts? It's not like they were taking DNA evidence. They didn't comprehend the concept. They didn't understand anything beyond the most primitive version of forensics and investigation. Crime scenes would have easily, in those slummy, crowded conditions, been tainted. Things could be tampered with. And I think that at least most of those murders ascribed to Jack the Ripper, therefore, don't even involve the original person who was involved in maybe the first case or two. It was somebody who killed several people. But if you strip back several of the other cases, out of the 5 that are even considered canonical, and you assume copycatting and things like that, what you really get is someone who went nuts, probably was in an asylum in fairly short order. You don't identify who it is, you don't have any forensics or anything, again, except beyond the basic, and they probably died in prison. It wouldn't even qualify as a serial killer. It was someone who went ballistic for a short period of time and may have killed 2 people. Well, that's not a serial killer. Could have been an attempted one. Someone goes psychotic. They would have picked him up on the streets. Or they drank themselves to death in the gin palace. Or they repented. They became a priest or something like that. It's entirely possible. There's no reason in my mind to think that there was even really a strong central caricature that would be ascribed, therefore, as Jack the Ripper. I think that it's the result, that the tale is the result of the moment in time in which the Whitechapel murders occurred. You have the rising consciousness of the middle and upper, class, the latter becoming more socially reformist, the former just becoming literate. And so you get the sensationalism. I would tell you, of course, the legacy media does this today as well. Anytime someone's killed, there's the possibility of serial killer or something, what do? It's on front page news, and all the people read about it, and even if they're 1,000 miles away, they lock the door at night. They get scared. They get weirded out about these things. It was happening back then, too. Again, the murders did happen within a small area. Do we have any data to not corroborate the fact that there were similar numbers of murders over similar spans of time in that gigantic urban ghetto sprawl where hundreds of thousands of unwashed masses drank and cavorted and beat each other up anyway? Do we have any particular reason to believe that other than someone getting disgruntled at prostitutes was actually at work? There might not be a serial killer MO even if you have a central Jack the Ripper. It could have literally been nothing more than disagreements over sexual services, not exactly someone who's going out of their way to commit murder, someone who is deeply disturbed and situationally disgruntled and antagonized by their own madness. And again, probably in that case ended up in an asylum and died there too. Eating lobster. Apparently it used to be poor people food. It was suggested as a prison food for hundreds of years. Oh no, now rich people eat it. I guess it's part of their social reform movement. So yes, long story short, I've come to the conclusion that in all likelihood, there never was a Jack the Ripper. Very fun story, well, macabre, fun from a distance over 100 years later. I'm unconvinced that the Whitechapel murders necessarily were even linked. That's about all. Peace out.